It is the early hours of September 22nd, 1914. Deep in the grey waters of the North Sea, the German submarine U-9 ploughs steadily westward on her petrol engines. The air inside the cramped hull is thick with fumes, every surface slick with condensation. Kapitänleutnant Otto Weddigen, an experienced officer with years in the Imperial Navy, scans the horizon through the narrow eyepiece of the periscope. His crew endured days of foul air and restless seas, watching and waiting for a target that never seemed to appear. Suddenly, Weddigen freezes. Against the pale horizon, masts and funnels rise. One ship, then another, then a third. 3 large cruisers, spread wide across the sea, their decks seemingly unaware of danger. The commander lowers his scope and gives the order to dive. The crew snap into motion, hatches sealed, motors cut, batteries engaged. After weeks of monotony, the chance has arrived. The hunt is about to begin. At the outbreak of the First World War, the North Sea quickly became a contested space where the might of the Royal Navy and the ambitions of the Imperial German Navy collided. Britain's command of the sea lanes was widely assumed, yet German naval planners sought to undermine this supremacy by turning to a new and still untested weapon, the submarine. Before the war, skeptics within the British Admiralty had largely dismissed the U-boat as a weapon of marginal utility. The submarine was seen as fragile, slow, and more likely to serve in reconnaissance than as a decisive instrument of naval warfare. Germany, however, invested in its development, and by 1914 possessed a small but capable force, eager to test its effectiveness in real operations. The early weeks of the war had already shown the dangers posed by this weapon. On September 5th, HMS Pathfinder, a light cruiser, had been struck and sunk by U-21 under Kapitänleutnant Otto Herzing, the first warship in history lost to a self-propelled torpedo fired from a submarine. This shocking event worried the Admiralty, yet many in Britain still considered such an incident the exception rather than the rule. Within this context sailed the vessels of the Royal Navy's 7th Cruiser Squadron, composed of older Cressy-class armoured cruisers, HMS Cressy, Aboukir, Hogue, and U-9’s. The squadron was tasked with patrolling the southern part of the North Sea. Their mission was to deter German raids against British waters and to protect the vital channel through which the British Expeditionary Force's supply lines to the continent passed. But the ships themselves were relics of an earlier naval era. Built between 1899 and 1902, they displaced over 12,000 tons, were heavily gunned and clad in armour, yet their design belonged to a pre-dreadnought world. Against modern threats like submarines, they were cumbersome and slow, averaging barely 21 knots at full speed and far less in practice due to age and wear. The deployment of these ships reflected a strategic dilemma. The Admiralty was under immense pressure to maintain an unbroken patrol line across the North Sea, demonstrating control of home waters. Yet the Grand Fleet could not be risked unnecessarily in such exposed waters close to German bases. The result was that these older cruisers, manned largely by reservists, were dispatched to perform a dangerous and monotonous duty. Admiral Sir John Jellicoe, commander of the Grand Fleet, recognized the vulnerability of the force and suggested adjustments, but the need to show presence overrode these concerns. Conditions on board were difficult. The Cressy-class cruisers had large crews, up to 700 men each, many of them not active service regulars, but recalled reservists, less practiced in modern naval drills. They sailed day after day in straight patrol lines, often at reduced speed to conserve coal. Across the North Sea, German submarine commanders prepared to exploit such weaknesses. Among them was Kapitänleutnant Otto Weddigen, commanding U-9. A veteran officer with years of service in the Imperial Navy, Weddigen had taken command of the boat in 1911 and had drilled his crew rigorously. U-9 itself was a relatively early model, but still capable. A 500-ton vessel with 2 propeller shafts, armed with 4 torpedo tubes. Its range was limited, and its surface speed only about 14 knots, but submerged it could strike with relative accuracy. On September 20th, U-9 left its base at Wilhelmshaven, ordered to patrol the Broad 14's area, a shallow stretch of the southern North Sea often used by British patrols. The risk for Weddigen was considerable. Submerged endurance was measured in hours, not days, and the primitive batteries quickly depleted. Ventilation was poor, the air foul. Communication with higher command was minimal once at sea. Each submarine was, in effect, left to its commander's discretion to seek targets and strike when opportunity presented. But the potential prize was immense. By late September, the 7th Cruiser Squadron had been on station for weeks. On September 20th, their flagship, HMS Euryalus, was withdrawn to refuel at Harwich, leaving 3 cruisers to patrol together. The trio steamed slowly on the morning of September 22nd, maintaining a steady course at about 10 knots. Seas were calm, visibility fair, and the mood aboard was routine. Few expected danger. Reports of submarines were circulated, but without destroyer protection, and with the prevailing belief that armoured cruisers were resilient, the threat was discounted by many officers. Meanwhile, U-9 approached the area. Weddigen and his crew had endured days of difficult patrolling with little to show. At dawn, on September 22nd, the North Sea had calmed. A north wind that had blown at force 5 during the night subsided, leaving the air clear and the waters smooth. The 3 cruisers, Aboukir, Hogue and Cressy, were patrolling in the broad 14s off the Dutch coast. Their speed was a steady 10 knots. The squadron steamed in line abreast, each ship separated by 2 nautical miles, spread across the sea in a wide formation. Special submarine lookouts had been posted, ordered to report the telltale feather of a periscope or the silhouette of an approaching vessel. On each cruiser, a gun stood manned and ready on either side, prepared to open fire at the first sign of danger. Unknown to them, U-9 had been shadowing the area since the small hours. Around 1 o'clock in the morning, Weddigen had glimpsed darkened ships in the night and dived his submarine to 15 meters, continuing westward cautiously under electric power. At dawn, he surfaced 22 nautical miles west of Scheveningen, switched to the petrol engines, and steered south toward the mast lightship. At 6 o'clock, his periscope picked out masts on the horizon. As he closed, he realized he was facing 3 4-funneled cruisers spread across the sea, with no destroyers in sight. For a moment, he suspected they might be the screen of a larger force, but no further ships appeared. Weddigen made his decision. He would attack. Shortly after 7 o'clock local time, U-9 maneuvered into position off the port bow of the center ship, HMS Aboukir. At 7:20, from just 500 meters, Weddigen fired a single torpedo. Seconds later, a tremendous explosion tore into Aboukir amidships on her port side. Water rushed into the engine room, and the cruiser's engines immediately failed. The ship lurched violently, listing 20 degrees almost at once. Captain Drummond and his officers first assumed they had struck a mine. Believing it an isolated accident, Drummond signaled for help from Hogue and Cressy. Damage control parties attempted to counter-flood the port-side compartments to correct the list, but the flooding was too rapid. Lifeboats were readied, but only 2 cutters remained aboard, the rest having been landed at the outbreak of war to reduce splinter hazards. 1 cutter was destroyed in the explosion, and the other could not be lowered because steam was unavailable for the winches. As Aboukir settled, whistles blew the order, "Every man for himself." Scores of sailors leapt into the water. At 7:45, 25 minutes after the torpedo hit, Aboukir capsized, floated for 5 minutes keel up, and then slipped beneath the surface. HMS Hogue, commanded by Captain Wilmot Nicholson, was already steering toward the stricken Aboukir. Nicholson believed that his comrade had struck a mine, but still approached to render aid. He ordered half his crew to prepare guns for action, and the other half to ready rafts and hammocks to throw to the men in the water. Boats were lowered as Hogue closed to just a few hundred meters. Captain Nicholson hoped to rescue survivors quickly and then steam clear. Beneath the surface, Weddigen saw his chance. U-9 had already reloaded its forward tubes and now crept into firing position against the stationary cruiser. At 7:55, from a range of 350 meters, Weddigen fired 2 torpedoes. On board Hogue, lookouts spotted the telltale bubbles of the torpedoes and even glimpsed the submarine's bow momentarily lifting from the sea under the strain of firing. The cruiser opened fire with her guns, joined by those of Cressy, but too late. Both torpedoes struck home on Hogue's port side, one beneath the funnels, the other near the after magazine. The results were catastrophic. Boiler rooms flooded instantly, steam hissed from ruptured pipes, and the ship quickly took on a heavy list. With watertight doors left half open, the flooding raced through the engineering spaces unchecked. Within 5 minutes, Nicholson gave the desperate order to abandon ship. Boats were already in the water rescuing men from Aboukir when Hogue herself began to heel. Sailors scrambled across the decks, some firing wildly into the sea at the fading glimpse of U-9’s periscope. At 8:15, just 20 minutes after being struck, Hogue capsized and plunged beneath the surface. Only Cressy remained afloat. Captain Robert Johnson had earlier been stationed on the left flank of the formation, roughly 370 meters off Aboukir's port beam. When Aboukir was struck, Johnson had stopped to launch boats and stood ready to assist. He received orders from Nicholson to keep a lookout for submarines, but as Hogue went down, his cruiser became the next target. From Cressy, lookouts reported sighting a periscope to port and then the tracks of torpedoes. Johnson immediately ordered full speed ahead and steered directly toward the spot, intending to ram the attacker. The crew opened a furious barrage against what turned out to be floating wreckage. At 8:20 local time, U-9 fired 2 stern-tube torpedoes from about 1,000 meters. One torpedo passed harmlessly under the cruiser, but the other struck aft, near the stern on the starboard side. Cressy staggered under the blow, but damage control parties worked quickly to close bulkheads, and she settled with only a 10-degree list. For a time, it seemed she might survive, and Johnson pressed on with rescue work. But Weddigen, watching through the periscope, was unconvinced. He decided to expend his last weapon. At 8:35, U-9 turned again and fired its final bow torpedo from 500 meters. This time, the missile struck squarely behind the afterbridge near the boilers. The explosion ripped through the hull, fires flared as fuel lines ruptured, and the cruiser's list increased sharply. Still, the gunners continued to fire, claiming hits on a phantom submarine that existed only in the confusion of battle. Johnson could see his ship was doomed. He gave the order to abandon ship. Cressy rolled over onto her beam ends, floated upside down for 15 to 20 minutes, with men still scrambling across her overturned hull, and finally sank at 8:55. The destruction of the 3 cruisers left the sea a vast field of wreckage. Hundreds of men clung to rafts, hammocks, and floating debris. Many had been in the water since the loss of Aboukir more than an hour earlier. 2 Dutch fishing vessels, wary of mines, initially hung back. But by 9:30, the Dutch steamer Flora arrived and hauled 286 men to safety. Another vessel, the Titan, rescued 147 more. British destroyers, led by Commodore Tyrwhitt, were already hurrying from Harwich, but they were still 50 miles away when the cruisers went down. By 11:15, British warships reached the scene and continued the work of rescue. In total, 837 men survived, but 1,459 officers and men perished, including Captain Johnson of Cressy. The breakdown was grim. 527 lost on Aboukir, 326 on Hogue, and 560 on Cressy. By mid-morning, the sea was quiet again. The smoke and wreckage drifted on the waves, while survivors huddled aboard trawlers and lifeboats. U-9 had slipped away undetected into the grey waters of the North Sea. In little more than an hour, Otto Weddigen and his crew had sunk 3 armoured cruisers of the Royal Navy, rewriting the rules of naval warfare. The waters of the Broad 14s carried wreckage and survivors long after U-9 had vanished. Rescue ships arrived too late to prevent devastating losses. Out of more than 2,000 men aboard the 3 cruisers that morning, fewer than 900 survived. Many of the dead were reservists, family men recalled only weeks earlier. For the Royal Navy, the destruction of Aboukir, Hogue, and Cressy was a bitter shock. The world's most powerful fleet had not been defeated in a clash of squadrons, but by a single submarine. The attack exposed the vulnerability of armoured cruisers patrolling without escort and overturned assumptions about what was safe at sea. What had once been dismissed as experimental technology had, in one morning, rewritten the rules of naval warfare. In Germany, Otto Weddigen and his crew returned to a hero's welcome. The Kaiser received them personally, while the press celebrated the sinking as proof of German ingenuity and the potency of the U-boat arm. To Berlin, the action was more than a victory. It was a sign that submarines could challenge British naval supremacy. Yet this was no conclusion. The Admiralty now faced the urgent need to adapt, while Germany's confidence in its undersea fleet grew. The North Sea was quiet for the moment, but the struggle for its waters was only beginning. Thank you for watching this video. Please leave a like. It really helps out the channel. If there is a topic, battle, or person you would like to know more about, let me know your thoughts in a comment. I would also like to thank all my patrons and channel members for their generous support. If you enjoy House of History and you want to support my work, consider joining me on Patreon. For just $1 per month, you will gain early access to all my videos without any in-video advertisements. Don't forget to subscribe. See you next time.